Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar about assessing writing. And we're introducing new teacher guides for the assessment of writing for B2 First for Schools and C1 Advanced. My name is Kate Hansford and I work as an exam support manager for Cambridge English. With me today is Laura Patsko. Laura is a language and learning consultant who spends a lot of her professional time these days developing digital learning content and tools. She's an experienced teacher, trainer and researcher specializing in teacher education, pronunciation and ELF, and is author or co-author of several books, chapters and articles on these topics.
Thanks very much, Kate. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I can see that you're all saying hello from your locations, and we have a very international group. It's great to be here with you all today. I'm hosting this webinar from Athens in Greece, so it's morning for me. So good morning, and I'd like to check before we go any further. Can you all see me and can you hear me? Please just type yes, yes in the chat box if you can see me and hear me. Great, perfect, wow. The chat box is moving at 1,000,000 miles a minute. Thank you so much, that's a good start. So let's begin with our webinar. We're going to talk this morning or this afternoon or this evening about teaching and assessing writing. And before we get into the real topic and some practical ideas, I want to get to know you a little bit. So there's going to be a poll on your screen in a moment, and I want to know how many of you are teaching learners who are at B2 level, but not in exam classes. And how many of you are preparing learners for the B2 First for Schools exam? So please answer the poll on your screen now. Great, okay, so it's about a 50-50 split. Okay, so about half of you are teaching learners at B2 level, not in exam classes, and about half of you are preparing students for the exam. Okay, and I can see in the chat box, some of you are doing both, and some of you are preparing for B2 first, but not for schools. Great, okay. Okay, thank you everybody. So that gives me an idea of our B2 teachers. Okay, the poll is now closed. And I've got one more question for you. Thinking about C1 level. So some of you are already prepared for this. You're guessing my next question and answering in the chat box. So how many of you are teaching at C1 but not an exam? And how many are you preparing learners for the C1 advanced exam? And then finally, something else. You're just here for professional development, but actually you're not teaching students at either of these levels. So please answer the poll on your screen now. Use the polls and vote now. Okay, all three, one of you responds in the chat box. Oh, and some of you are preparing learners for C2. Okay, we'll mention that in just a moment. All of the above, okay, CPE, okay, so proficiency level, yep. And some of you are preparing students for multiple exams like Advantage, ESOL, okay. Okay, so quite a lot of you preparing learners at high levels for a range of exams. Some of you are mentioning C2 proficiency, and a couple of you not teaching for exams. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you so much, everybody. That really helps me understand who I'm talking to, which is no bad thing when we're doing an event with so many people here. So a couple of more open questions for you to learn a little bit more about your opinion to teaching these levels. So later in the webinar, we're going to look specifically at the guide that we've developed, but I want to know a little bit about how you feel about teaching writing. And I'm going to ask you two questions. Can you use the chat box to share your ideas? Question number one is focusing on the bright side. So for you, in your experience, what is the best thing about teaching and assessing writing? at these high levels? What do you really enjoy about this? Self-discovery. Okay, it's challenging. Yes, definitely challenging. But if you enjoy a challenge, that's no bad thing. Lots of you challenging. Yes, the creativity of some learners. Absolutely. And I think that's true at all levels. But the beauty of teaching at higher levels is you really see that creativity growing as learners become more able to express themselves. Students sharing their ideas. Creative thinking. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that's something that we try to develop at all levels, but it's really nice to see students at higher levels when that criticality has grown and developed with them as their language skills have grown. Seeing improvement. That's interesting. I sometimes find when I'm teaching very high levels that it's difficult to see their improvement on a day-to-day basis when they arrive in my classroom. So that's interesting that that's one of your best bits. All right, and maybe you can predict that my second question for you is, what are the challenges of teaching and assessing writing at these high levels at B2 and C1? So a lot of you mentioned that you like the challenge. What are some of these challenges? What do you find kind of tricky about teaching writing and assessing writing to learners at B2 and C1 level? So meeting the students' needs, yes. And yes, showing students that they're actually progressing. Yeah, this is what I was saying. I have this experience too. Pointing out what they forget. That's interesting. So assessing not only what they produce, but what they don't produce. I remember that as a tip I was given by a trainer when I was a very new teacher. And I said, what do I do with this C1 learner? And my trainer said, the trick is looking at what they're not writing, not just what they're writing. You know, where are the gaps? Motivation, that's interesting. Some of you saying the challenges are motivation. So even at high levels, it's sometimes difficult to motivate learners. Clarity of ideas and not only the language. Yeah, absolutely. Helping students correct their errors. Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit later about self-correction and self-assessment, which is a really important part of learning at all levels, but especially at very high levels where learners' individual needs become much more evident. Peer editing, good, I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes, okay, so that can be very challenging. And again, later on, we're going to see some examples of that. Well, thank you so much. You have so many ideas. This is fantastic. And it's really encouraging to see so many similar ideas from teachers all over the world. And I think that's helpful to remember that actually we face a lot of the same challenges and we also enjoy a lot of the same things. So we can learn a lot from each other in the next 50 minutes or so. So these are the aims for our webinar today. This is not a webinar on how to assess writing. It's a webinar about the guides that we've produced for Cambridge English to help you learn how to really teach writing in a way that prepares your students later for assessment. So we're going to show you these guides. We're going to show you how this resource can support you as teachers and support learners, really with attention to the teaching and assessment. They can be used as a training resource to help you assess your students' writing, but really the main purpose is practical. So we're going to focus on practical teaching activities that you can try. And we're going to show you how these guides include real examples of writing by exam candidates and the grades and the comments that they receive. So at all levels, not just at high levels, I find it really helpful as a teacher to see an example of what I'm dealing with and to understand what would happen if my students produced something like that in their exam. What grade would they get? What comments would the examiner make? But then, of course, that's only useful if I know what to do next in my classroom. So these guides have been designed with help your learners improve their writing for an exam later, which you may be preparing them for now, or maybe they're thinking about doing in the future. So some of you said in the chat box that you are not currently preparing learners for exams, but because these guides are focused on teaching and learning, the content and the activities should still be very useful for you. So hopefully at the end of this webinar, you'll all have got something practical from it. So let's look at the guides. So these brand new guides are designed to help you teach and assess learners' writing in preparation for their exams. But as I said, even if you're not preparing learners for a specific exam, the focus is really on learning and developing your writing skills. Now, the exams that Cambridge produces are designed to test writing in a fair and realistic way. So if you do these kinds of activities with your learners, their writing should improve and their self-awareness should improve. And if they take an exam, then that should be a good reflection of their writing skills. So the guides exist at 5 different levels. Some of you may have attended the last webinar given by Dr. Miranda Hamilton about the guides for the lower levels, the A2 and the B2 and the B1 for schools exams. This webinar is focusing on the higher levels, specifically the B2 first for schools and C1 advanced. And there is also a guide now available for the C2 proficiency exam. But in this webinar, we're going to focus on B2 and C1. Now, the guides are designed for teachers, and this is really important to remember, is these documents are made for people who are working directly with learners every day. They're not designed for assessors or examiners, but the information in the guides will help you understand as a teacher what the examiners are looking for. So the guides include teaching tips and classroom activities. They have information about how to assess writing skills. They also have authentic samples of learner writing with examiner grades and comments. These are authentic. The previous candidates who performed at different levels of ability in a Cambridge exam, all of them have been anonymized. So don't worry, it's not possible to see in the guide which learner in the world wrote the original sample, but they are real original samples. So you can trust that this is a genuine reflection of what a learner can do and what feedback they would get. And later in the webinar, I'll show you exactly where they live on the Cambridge English website. And the guides also feature practice assessment activities. So this is a good way for you as a teacher to compare your assessment with the assessment that a Cambridge English examiner would do. Now, you might be thinking, with everything that's happening in the world now, why produce a guide about assessing writing? You know, we need to know more about how to teach online in a global pandemic. That's definitely true, and there's a lot of information available there for you now. But one of the reasons that these guides are such a valuable resource now is because face-to-face professional development is not an option for so many of us. So we've designed these guides not only to be useful generally, even when there is no global pandemic, but also just as a teacher development tool for you now. A lot of us are working from home, teaching from home, you know, finding our timetables and our skills a little disrupted. And I know for me and many teachers, some of us have had our confidence affected by the fact that we're doing so many new things so suddenly. So these guides are designed to rebuild your confidence and use this as professional development. They're informative, so there's information about the exam, but they're also designed to be easy to follow and to understand. Really, the idea is to support you, to support your students. And for that purpose, we've kept them very practical. They're full of tips and useful teaching ideas. So this is a little bit different from, for example, the hand exams, which is really information about how the exam works in a very kind of serious and detailed way. These are designed to be more practical, the kind of information you need when you're in your classroom and you want to develop skills. So later in the webinar, I'll show you where they live on the website. Let me show you now quickly what they look like. So there are a few design features in these new guides, which might be a little bit different from what you're used to. Now, a lot of us are working online or on screens at the moment. So when you find the guides, if you prefer to work on paper, of course you can print them. But what's really important is that it's not necessary to print them in order to navigate them. So the guides have been designed with navigational tools and hyperlinks within the document so you can navigate them on screen. This is a screenshot from one of the guides. This is the B2 First for Schools guide. And you can see here that there are navigation tips. So in the document, there are little arrows that you can click to navigate around the guides, to go straight to a specific point and to go back again. So this helps take you where you want to go. I know if you could see my whole screen at the moment, you would see a million tabs and windows and documents open. You know, it's quite overwhelming working on a screen. So these documents have been designed to help you make some of that pain away. And this is not just true for the whole document, but it's also true for individual sections and individual activities. So if I show you an example, here's an example of, you don't worry about reading the detail of this now, but this is what it looks like on your screen when you navigate to one of the activities. This is from the B2 First for Schools guide. And you can see that these letters in bold are actually clickable links. So the idea is to take the pain out of searching through documents. It takes you directly to the resource you need. It's intended to save you time by making it easy to find what you need in the PDF. Now, there's also a lot of attention paid in these new guides to helping you understand all of the jargon, all of the terminology, particularly if you are teaching at a higher level, but maybe don't have a lot of experience of teaching with exams. There's a lot of terminology in the guides. And that terminology is really useful. We need to have a common language to discuss these things, but sometimes it's quite a lot to get your head around. So the guides have been designed with some sections which highlight key elements of teaching for an exam class. The terminology is also explained. There's a little glossary box. So here's an example. We often refer to descriptors. This screenshot is taken from the level guide to explain what we mean when we say descriptor and band and subscale. And then somewhere else on the page, there's a little glossary box like this. So these little boxes give you a bit of information about what those are. Now, of course, these guides are designed for teachers, but when you speak to your students about the exam and about how they're going to be assessed, these terminology explanations could also be helpful for them. And if I give you an example of what this means and how this is detailed on the page, so a descriptor is a detailed note to help the examiners and teachers to use the assessment subscales, the criteria. So if we say, for example, for organization, at the different levels of exam, at B1 preliminary for schools, B2 first for schools, C1 advanced, it's really helpful as a teacher to understand how that descriptor for one organization, how is that different at different levels? What are the small differences between each level? So that as my students develop, I can help them get better and not stay stuck at one level. And this is presented in the guide side by side, so you can see an example that helps you understand how the descriptors apply to each level. So there's a lot of information like this in the guides. Again, it's intended to be very practical. It's intended to help you not only understand how the exams work and how to teach your learners to develop their skills in writing for assessment. So not just to understand that, but also to use that information in a practical way. There are also activity boxes. So every level of guide, the A2, B1, B2, C1, and C2, every level has 6 activities, 2 which focus on teacher assessment, two which focus on peer assessment, and two which focus on self-assessment. These are all color-coded and given in a specific section, so you can find the activity with all of the steps. And in some cases, there is also an adaptation provided for the activity. So if this particular activity doesn't work exactly in your context, you may find that the adaptation helps you use it in a different way, maybe with a different assessment angle. For example, you could use one of the activities from the teacher assessment section. You could adapt it to use it for peer assessment, for example. So all of these are in the guide with clear color coding, clear icons in separate boxes to help you navigate and read quickly and easily. So this has all been designed really to make this process easier for you. Okay, so that's a lot of information to throw at you now. Let's get into the practical side of things. We're going to look at pedagogy and assessment and really talk about what we do in our classrooms. Some of you are asking in the chat box about the slides, the links, the material, and the answer is yes, you will get all of this material afterwards. So within a week or so after the webinar, you'll get an email with a link to download your certificate, a link to the slides, and in the slides, there are links to the website, and I'm going to show you that later as well. So for now, just sit back, relax, participate. You will get all of this information at the end. Now, I've been talking at you for quite a long time. I want to hear your ideas again. In the previous webinar, Miranda Hamilton focused on teacher assessment and told you a little bit about peer and self-assessment. In this webinar, we're going to focus on peer and self-assessment, and then I'll just tell you a little bit about teacher assessment. And there will be recordings available of both of these webinars later too. So don't worry if you feel like you've missed something. You can go back and watch the recording of the other event. Now, what I'd like you to do is share your own top tips. And I'm going to put you in groups. Now, this should be fun as there are over 1,000 of you. I'm going to put you in 2 different groups. I want one group to think about peer assessment, one group to think about self-assessment. And in the chat box, I want you to share your, now I'll give you the questions and then I'll tell you your groups. So I'd like you to share your top tips about learners assessing their own writing and each other's writing and giving feedback. And I'd like you to share your experience of what works students. Now your groups are according to your birthdays. So if your birthday falls in the first half of the year, January to June, I'd like you to share ideas about peer assessment. So in the chat box, type PA for peer assessment and then your idea. If your birthday falls between July and December, the second half of the year, then I want you to share ideas about self-assessment. So when you share an idea, you'll type SA and then your idea. So for example, my birthday is in August. That's the second half of the year. I would share my top tips for self-assessment. So please, in the chat box, in your groups, can you share what top tips do you have for your group's focus and what works well for your students? Please share your experience with others. Self-assessment to refer to when writing. Yeah, great. Peer assessment. Using grids. Yes, using colors, getting them to identify and organize things to address in each other's writing. Self-assessment, write the comments and then students use scales to give themselves a mark. Yeah, that's a really nice idea. So a good combination of kind of teacher guidance and self-assessment. Self-assessment, write and improve is becoming more popular among your more advanced students. So write and improve is one of the Cambridge English online tools. If you're not familiar with it, it's a free website where students can do a writing task and then get immediate automatic feedback and improve their own writing. Self-assessment, self-evaluation questions based on a set of criteria. Yeah, exactly. Really nice. So I think giving students criteria to follow is a common theme I can see you all mentioning. Self-assessment, writing about something memorable for them, using colors and drawings and then sharing their ideas. That's a really nice idea, actually, of just focusing on the content and on the ideas, writing about something memorable and then sharing it. Peer assessment. Aha, very nice. So look at someone else's piece of writing, look at the collocations and the vocabulary, and try to change the simple one to a more complex one without changing the meaning. Great, there's some really fantastic ideas here, really nice, really creative. And I think you're going to find a little bit of overlap with the suggestions in the guides. So this is fantastic. You could have written these guides. I'm sure you can add many more activities to the 6 which are already there. So here's one example from the B2 First for Schools guide, is to give learners a checklist or a model to use when they're giving feedback to a classmate. So giving them a really clear list of things to look for when you mark a piece of writing. If you've done this before, can you mention in the chat box, have you ever tried using a checklist or a model answer for peer assessment? So learners look at an exam list and then they look at their classmates' writing. So a lot of you, yes, a lot of yeses, great, okay. A lot of you have used both. Always a grid. One of you always use a grid. I'd like to see the grid you use on your screen. That will help me understand the balance of, okay, here we go. So yes, yes, yes. Okay, so lots of you have used checklists or samples with your students. Fantastic, great, great. So it sounds like you're going to respond well to a lot of activities in the guides then, because this is the kind of thing that we suggest is a very practical, like, you know, try using this and then work through the steps. Those of you who are already using similar approaches can find new ways of using them. Great, thank you. And just a little bit of detail, please, in the chat box. If you have used a checklist or a model for students to work, how did they respond to that? And if you've never used a checklist, would you try it? So you can just type your answers into the chat box for this one. You don't need to use a poll. Okay, so a lot of you saying very positive. They were happy with it. They knew what to focus on. They felt sure of what they did. Right, good. And a lot of you saying, yes, I would like to try it. It sounds like that's a good idea because a lot of you are saying that you've tried. Great. Oh, brilliant, brilliant. So many of you trying it and wanting to try it. Great. And yeah, using it to assess themselves as well. Exactly. So in this case, the suggestion is to use it for peer assessment, but you can absolutely use checklists for self-assessment too. And here's another example of a top tip for peer assessment. So when you read the guides, you'll see these blue sections, which are labeled with a star saying top tips. And one of them, which comes up in almost every guide, is just to remind learners to communicate, because writing is not all about accuracy. And I think this is quite important to remember, especially when we do things like checklists. They're wonderful and they're helpful, but there's a time and a place for accuracy. And it's easy for students to forget why they're writing in the first place. The reason that we write is to communicate. So if we can include activities in our teaching which allow them to assess the communicative achievement of their writing, they're doing it, and it won't feel so scary. You'll notice as well that some of the tips and some of the activities in the guides focus on specific writing assessment subscales. So in this case, for example, the tip is to invite learners to think about the content of their writing and the way it's organized, and to praise each other before they criticize. Students don't always feel comfortable giving each other feedback, and I think that's often because they feel criticized. But if we focus first of all on communication and achievement, then it doesn't feel so scary. Now, in terms of self-assessment, a couple of top tips which appear in the guides at the higher levels, the B2 First for Schools and the C1 guide. A couple of these tips focusing themselves. And one thing that I've found at very high levels is some students are very hard on themselves. They really expect themselves to be a lot better than they are. And they sometimes forget that actually they are very transferring the skill to another language. And so one of the tips for the high level students is to not be afraid to use the learner's first language for a specific purpose of self-awareness. Because remember that our target when we're teaching a second language is not to erase a monolingual and replace it with an English monolingual. Our target is to create a confident bilingual user of English. Now, if your students are real English, but actually they're very confident in their first language, that can boost their confidence and improve their self-awareness. And they realize that actually they're very good writers. They're just learning how to do it in another language. And that change in mindset can very much improve their motivation. Now, a quick poll just to see how many of you are aware of students. Do you have students who are confident writers in their first language, but simply not confident writing? I'm surprised at this when I've looked at some of my students' writing and I think, well, their speaking is excellent and they're generally very confident. Why are they struggling so much to write in English? And then when I have a discussion with them, I find that they're very confident writing in their first language. First language and their second language are quite different, and they feel very uncomfortable with what is good writing in English, and they feel very uncomfortable changing some of their habits because it's so successful for them in their first language. So do you have students who are very confident writing in their first language, but not in English? Quite a lot of you. Okay, quite a lot of you. And yes, some of you mentioning in the chat box that even in their first language, they don't get a lot of practice. And absolutely, practice is critical for developing all skills. We only get better at things by doing them more. So self-awareness is part of it, and then practice is part of it. And again, just a little bit of detail in the chat box. If you're able to comment on your experience, if you use bilingual or plurilingual strategies, so strategies of moving between languages, which is what bilinguals do, how do your students respond to this? And again, if you've never used such an approach, would you try it? Yes, no, or maybe. There's no poll for this question, just use the chat box. Yes, maybe, yeah. I often find it, especially at higher levels, teachers are often very reluctant to use the student's first language. And I understand why. We believe that our students should be capable of doing most things in English at this level. The comment here and the tip is not to suggest that they'll conduct all their lessons in English and do all their work in English. The tip is to remember that we're not replacing one monolingual with another. We're developing a confident, competent bilingual. And that means recognizing and different behaviors in their different language, and that's natural. And being aware of those differences can actually help them manage the skills that they're trying to develop. Some of you, yeah, encouraging them to read, yes. My students at all times prefer a bilingual approach, exactly. And I think sometimes giving permission to acknowledge, yes, I have a different first language, makes it feel less taboo when they do need to use their first language. And this doesn't mean translating everything. This means recognizing your identity as a bilingual. Okay, great. Thank you so much for all those ideas. Now let's continue, and I'll just give you one last example of a self-assessment tip, C1 Advanced Guide. And the tip here is really helping learners at advanced levels do more with less. Now, if your students are anything like mine, you probably find that they always want more new stuff, new vocabulary, more grammar. And we give it, and they don't feel progress. They think, well, okay, I have more, but I never use it. This vocabulary is not very common, or I already knew that grammar. And at advanced levels, one of the things that makes the difference, that shows how advanced they are with language they already have. So in the advanced level guide, one of the activities, and this is a link in the document, shows you how learners can do this. How can you help them do more with less? So you can follow the link in the guide to the suggested activity and practice this tip. And when you get to the activity, you'll see that it has clear aims and a clear focus. It has step-by-step instructions so that it's very easy to follow, and it has some really clear examples. And I won't show you those now because we're going to do this activity together in a moment. But before we get there, just briefly to mention that we're focusing on peer assessment and self-assessment in this webinar, but of course, teacher assessment is still important, and every guide has tips for all three types of assessment: teacher, peer, and self. So 2 top tips for teacher assessment include using different strategies to giving feedback, like audio or video instead of written feedback. And especially at advanced levels, encouraging learners to be ambitious and not afraid of mistakes, because the examiners want to see that learners can be ambitious and try to use more advanced language. So just to summarize, why is meaningful feedback so valuable for learning? How does this support learning? Well, as I've said many times, and as I think you agree, as some of you have been saying in the chat box, it's about confidence. And I know in my experience of studying a language for many years and becoming quite an advanced user, sometimes my confidence is there, but my motivation isn't, because I can already say everything I need to say. So how do I continue getting better? How do I continue, developing my range? Meaningful feedback is really important there. It also promotes self-awareness, which is absolutely critical at learning for all levels, because of course they cannot carry the teacher in their pocket everywhere they go. And particularly in the current circumstances globally, where a lot of us are learning online, self-awareness and self-study is absolutely essential for development. And this self-awareness and this self-study more autonomous, because again, they can't take you with them everywhere. And all of this feedback and development ultimately will improve learner performance. And that's what the other part of this guide is about. So not just the teaching, the performance, what happens when we have developed our learners' skills and empowered them, yes, as somebody is saying in the chat box, empowered them to communicate more and feel in control of their English communication. Well, that will improve their performance in contexts where that performance is being assessed. Let's do a very quick example of a self-assessment activity. And this one comes from the C1 Advanced Guide. And you'll notice that it's connected to the language assessment subscale. So in this particular example, in activity number 6 from the C1 Advanced Guide to Assessing Writing, we're looking at developing the range of language and really active use of language. Learners understand more than they produce. And at advanced levels, one of the things which occurs again and again and again in the assessment criteria and in the examiner's mind is range. Show me the variety of things you can do in English. So this activity helps the learners become self-aware and develop a kind of personal journal, a personal vocabulary notebook. And we're going to do the activity together. So I hope you're in learner mode now. Switch your brain from teacher to learner. Imagine you are developing your skills for the C1 level. And in this activity, you get the learners started with 3 to 4 examples of high frequency vocabulary or grammar structures. So here, my example is the word never. Now we teach the word never at A1 level. This is a really, really low level word. And at an advanced level, students might be thinking, yeah, I know this word, I use it all the time. But remember that at higher levels, it's about teaching learners to do more with less, do new things with old language. So in their books, they create a table like this. They have this word, never. They have the common or more familiar usage that we teach them at very low levels, like I have never been skiing, or I never drink coffee. And what you want them to do is generate some ideas of less common usage, or maybe not generate ideas, but just notice this in context when they're reading. Some of you are already doing this, so can you please type your ideas into the chat box? Some of you are saying, never have I ever. Well, I never. Yes, exactly. Inversion, absolutely. Some of you are suggesting alternatives like with no or with other negative structures. A never-ending story, never mind. Fantastic. So you get the idea, and this is something that you are all able to do as advanced users of English, but your learners might not realize that they can do so much with a word that's so familiar. Here are a couple examples that appear in the guide. Some of you have mentioned these, so never say never. Somebody just typed this in the chat box as I revealed it. Wow, you're reading my mind. Never in my wildest dreams. Nevertheless, so the word never occurring inside another word. Never, 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 ever, etc. Okay, you're doing fantastically. I'll give you just a moment to try a couple others. Take your choice. Here's an example of another vocabulary item, so open, and a grammar structure, so past participles. So any ideas in the chat box of some less common or more advanced usage of these words? Open-minded, keep an open mind, yes. Open day, interesting, I didn't think of that one. An opening for something, yep. Open heart surgery, wow, another one I didn't think of. Fantastic. An open and shut case, What about past participles? So something like loved or learned. What are some less common or more advanced usages of past participles? Think also about pronunciation here. Yes, excellent. A couple of you are typing beloved. Fantastic, you're reading my mind. Seen and not heard. Now that's a really nice example. So past participles within idioms. Terrific. Okay, so here's a couple of examples. Access, open-ended, a tin opener, to greet someone with open arms, open as usual. So you can see that there's a wide range of advanced usages here, some of which are in fixed expressions, some of which are in idioms, some of which are in verb phrases, and past participles. So pronunciation, so things like beloved or learned being used as an adjective, and therefore the pronunciation being different, and really not very common usages. And also in participle clauses, which we often teach at C1 level. Fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for your ideas. So you'll see some examples in the guide of activities with tips. And the important thing as well, I think, for teachers is that we don't just give you an activity and a tip, but we also give you a kind of answer key so that you don't look at an activity and think, that's great, but what do I do when they do the activity? Or what will they produce and how do I respond? So there's lots of information in the guides, not only about the activity, but how to respond to it. So you're learning as well as them. Let me give you one example from my personal experience of a kind of a very common high frequency phrase. So I'm learning Greek at the moment. I live in Athens in Greece. And one of the first phrases, where are you? Which is pou είσαι. Any Greek attendees, you can correct my pronunciation later. And something I've learned recently, which is pushing me to advanced levels, is as I take my little dog for a walk around the streets, people him, pou είσαι? You say, where are you? And I think, well, this is a very strange expression. Why are they asking him, where are you? He's right here. But this is a really nice example of how your learners can have a phrase in their mind which they only associate with one people. And sometimes you need to open their mind and show them that these phrases can exist in other contexts. They can be used in different ways. They can surprise you. So it's a kind of about teaching your students to be language detectives and to enjoy the process of learning new ways of using old language. Okay, so let's summarize. We're moving quickly to the end of the webinar, and I really want to get on and show you where to find these guides. So you'll notice that in the guides, the activities are sometimes linked explicitly to the subscales. And where that's the case, it's always shown in the description. So you'll see, for example, here is the language subscale, and the language subscale for C1 Advanced talks about a range of vocabulary. Remember, I said at this level, range is really important. They want to see sophistication. And importantly, if there are errors present, it's because the student is trying to use less common words. Now, this is band 5. This is the highest level of C1 assessment. It's okay to make a couple mistakes. And this is what I was saying before about teaching students to really remember that they're trying to communicate, and it's okay to be a little ambitious. And in the description of the activity, you'll see that this is highlighted when it's relevant to a subscale. So my last question for you before we finish the webinar and summarize some of these tips is to fill in the gap in the guide. So here you'll see that the activity begins, step number 1, asking your students to discuss why is keeping a reflective language journal like this, developing their vocabulary, why is this so useful for language learning? And I'd like to know your ideas first. And can you just type your ideas into the chat box? Why is it useful? Thank you to all of you who are practicing my Greek in the chat box. Why is it like this with your students to keep a reflective journal? What are some of the learning tips? Okay, so autonomy helps them remember to see their progress. Yes, absolutely, especially at high levels when progress can be kind of quite small and incremental, unlike at low levels where in a week they might feel like they learned a lot. A review tool, yes, definitely. So from time to time, they can go back to their vocabulary journal and review. Creativity, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. This can really help your creative writing when you realize, the range of vocabulary available to you. Internalizing and personalizing learning, yes, absolutely, absolutely. Great ideas. So you'll see a lot of these same ideas are innovation over a long period, keeps a record of things that don't occur very often so they don't forget them. Also helps them identify common challenges. So having a personal journal where you kind of keep track of things that you're trying to remember can help you see where you need to pay attention and overcome your challenges. And also just to give daily practice of writing, simply writing things down so that it becomes more natural and more comfortable. Okay, so let's finish off looking at assessing learners' writing and how the guides help you do this. So the guides have step-by-step teacher training. So it's training on the page. This is to help you assess learners at those moments where you're thinking, I really need help understanding the criteria and how to grade my students' work. So in the guides, this example on this slide comes from C1 Advanced, but every guide has the criteria for that level. You'll see the criteria or the subscales across the top, the grade boundaries down the side, and the rest of the table includes useful information, helpful information, descriptors explaining what these mean for the examiners. But also you might be thinking, as a teacher, what does it all mean? Well, the guide is designed to help you. Table in the guide, but we also put specific examples in kind of more everyday language. So for content, for example, it's good if the candidate answered the task, they did what they were asked to do. It's not good if they didn't include everything or they've written something irrelevant. And the same for communicative achievement, the same for organization, the same for language. So these are phrased in more sort of everyday learner-friendly language. So as a teacher, you can read both. You can read the more detailed kind of examiner language, and you can also read the more graded, learner-friendly version, which not only helps you, but helps you have a conversation with your students. The key terms are highlighted in a section of the guide with an explanation of what does this mean? So what does it mean to be coherent? What are organizational patterns? You know, can you give me an example or tell me in everyday English? So the idea really is to help you know how to assess learners' performance. And in practice, this looks different for different learners and for different tasks. So one of the sections of the guides has real examples, color-coded, highlighted examples which connect each exam subscale, like organization or communicative achievement, to a real sample with real examiner comments. It looks like this. Don't worry, I know this is very small. I don't expect you to read this, but just to show you that there's an script. Remember, it's all anonymous. This particular example focuses on communicative achievement for a part 1 essay. It has some examples. The guide, this has examples for each subscale. So there's an example for communicative achievement, one for organization, one for language, etc. It also has examples of different levels of performance, so stronger and weaker, and sometimes a kind of mid-range. And the highlighting in the text helps you compare what the examiner commented on with what the candidate wrote. So you can really understand, you're not searching through the script saying, well, the examiner said they use straightforward and complex ideas, but which ones are straightforward? Which ones are complex? This is all highlighted for you. And one extra feature which occurs only at the very high level guides is this one. Why not band 5? I know when I'm teaching, sometimes my students produce something excellent. It's really close to this sample, and the sample comment says, this is all really good, band 4. And I think, why is it not band 5? How can they do it better? So at the high levels, this is included. There are tip boxes explaining why not, like what can they do to go that extra bit further and get a better mark. All of the sample answers are included with a kind of try it yourself tip. So you'll see that there are, for example, in the B2 First for Schools guide, 5 sample answers. There are also assessment templates, assessment templates and links to where to find those templates in the guide, so you can click directly to them. And I'll just show you what these look like. So the assessment templates are supplied in each guide. There are hyperlink templates, so you can print it out if you want. And there's also links to lots of other resources, some of which you've already mentioned in the chat box. And these are things that you want to explore when you look at the guides. So let me show you where to find the guide, and then we'll have a couple minutes left for questions. So you'll go to this link on the Cambridge English website. It's called Your Newsroom. There's a lot of different information there, particularly relevant to the current global situation. You want to go straight down to the section about understanding learners' levels and needs. It looks like this. My colleague is going to put a link in the chat box for you. The important thing is just to scroll down this page. So you click on the levels and needs bit and you scroll down to where you see this picture and this section, Guides to Assessing Writing. All right, I'm going to leave a review of the session on the screen. These are the things that we've talked about. I know there's a lot of information there, and I'm so grateful for your attention. Thank you so much for joining us this morning or this afternoon or evening, wherever you are. And there's time now. We've got 5 minutes left if anybody has any questions that I hope I can try and answer. There is a Q&A section. Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you for hosting me.
Can you
Let me have a quick look at some of the questions.
Yeah, can you see them coming in the Q&A box?
I can see lots of questions. I will leave my summary slide on screen for you to read. Let me look at. You asks, what about communicative achievement? Now you asked that quite early in the webinar, so I hope I've addressed that by now, but just to clarify, that communicative achievement, along with all of the other subscales, is addressed in the sample answers, in the examiner comments. Every subscale has an example of a real candidate script with real comments, a real grade, and the activities focus on a range of different subscales. A sample peer assessment checklist for writing somebody's asked for. So there are 5 guides available for different levels. So A2, key for schools, B1, preliminary for schools, B2, first for schools, C1 advanced, and C2 proficiency. And there is not a sample peer assessment checklist in all of them, but so that they're not too repetitive, because a lot of teachers teach at different levels, you may find that if you look at a different level guide, you'll find something that is similar to what you are missing. So let's say you want a peer assessment checklist for C1, it's not there, but there might be one in B1 that you can adapt. So even if you're not teaching at another level, it's worth looking at the other levels guides if you want a wider range of teaching ideas. In terms of how do we assess confidence in their own language, somebody asked, I asked you earlier, are your students confident writing in their own language, but not in English? One thing that you can do, which actually I learned a while ago when looking at students with specific learning difficulties like dyslexia, is to give them a task of something to write, which they know about. So there's not too much thinking required, like write a little summary of what you did yesterday. Give them a piece of paper and ask them to write. And it doesn't even matter if you speak that first language. You can just observe the fluency with which they write. If they hesitate, if they have difficulty with the size of their handwriting and so on. Now, this is a little bit different if you're teaching online at the moment, I understand. But if you're able to do that and to see what they're writing, not only does that give you an insight into the mechanics of writing, which can be useful if you're, if you suspect that a student has a specific learning difficulty, but it can also help you just observe their general comfort level. Do they look really nervous when they have to write something down? Do they look stressed? Can they write a lot? Or do you have to stop them after 10 minutes? They only wrote one sentence and they're not comfortable. So just by simple observation of the writing process, you can tell quite a lot. Let me look a little bit at some of the more recent questions. Is it true that there are no 0.5 marks for writing assessment? Yes, it is. So there are 5 bands, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or potentially 0 if the learner doesn't attempt the task. Somebody asks, are these criteria, so the 4 subscales, seen only on C1 Cambridge exams? No, they're not. They are common to almost all levels. And in each of the guides, you'll see the subscales or the criteria that are relevant to that level. Do you teach all the skills separately or integrated? Well, personally, I teach things in a very integrated way. Now, this guide has been designed just for the writing exam because the exam papers are conducted separately. But of course, when we use language in a very integrated way. We mix skills. So personally, I like to assess things in a very integrated way and to teach things in an integrated way. Will there be a separate guide for first, not specifically for schools? Somebody asks. To the best of my knowledge, no. The First for Schools guide is the only guide. However, the activities have been designed in a way that are applicable for that level of language, not just that age level. So even if you're teaching B2 first, not the First for Schools version, you should still find useful content in the guides. I'm conscious that we're out of time. I should probably stop with the questions there. You have so many excellent questions. Thank you so much. Thank you to Cambridge English for hosting me, and to Kate and Rasheen and the team for managing the technology. Very much appreciated.
And just a reminder to everybody that you will be sent a link to the slides and certificate. A lot of people are asking about where they can find the teacher's guides. So we will email that to you later. And thank you so much, Laura. It's been fantastic. These guides are amazing. So we'll say goodbye to everybody and have a good day. Bye.